The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows on the concrete streets of San Jose, California. A light breeze swirled through the narrow alleys, rustling papers and gently swaying the flags hung outside the upscale tech offices. Amid the golden haze of early evening, a scuffed red scooter zipped past the rows of Tesla-charged parking spaces and minimalist cafes. On the back was Marcus Williams, a 20-year-old with tired eyes, a fading name tag clipped to his slightly wrinkled shirt, and a stack of hot pizza boxes strapped securely behind him. The smell of cheese, pepperoni, and toasted crust lingered in the air as he pulled up to the sleek, glass-fronted building of Technova, a name he had grown both familiar and bitter toward over the last few weeks. He parked near the service entrance just as he always did. It wasn't his first delivery to this building, but something about this evening felt different. Maybe it was the tense email conversation he'd overheard while waiting in the reception last time, or the way the receptionist had looked at him, like he was invisible, or worse, irrelevant. Marcus had long ago accepted that delivering pizzas wasn't glamorous, but what irked him wasn't the job. It was the way people treated him because of it. He had the mind of an engineer, the soul of a mathematician, and a vision for systems far more advanced than anything he saw at Technova. But to them, he was just the pizza guy. As he stepped into the marble-floored lobby, carrying two boxes marked urgent, Marcus scanned the usual surroundings. The massive LCD screens looping company ads, the cold metal sculpture in the center meant to signify innovation, and the receptionist, Sarah, who gave him a fake smile, barely masking her disdain. "Leave it in the break room, top floor," she said, returning to her screen before he could reply. No elevator access, of course, just the service stairs. He sighed inwardly but nodded, adjusting the boxes and starting the long climb up. By the time he reached the top floor, his shirt was sticking to his back, but he kept his expression neutral. The door to the executive conference room was slightly ajar, and laughter spilled out. Sharp, artificial, the kind of laughter that rarely reached the eyes. He knocked politely before stepping inside. The room went silent for a moment, then resumed its chatter without acknowledging him. Only one man looked up, Richard Blackstone, the CEO of Technova. Tall, sharply dressed, and with an ego that filled the room faster than his cologne, Blackstone stared at Marcus with mild amusement. "Oh, the pizza's here. Finally," he said, as if Marcus were a delay in his otherwise perfect schedule. "Put it over there, and be quick about it." Marcus did as he was told, placing the boxes on the table. He turned to leave, but paused when he saw the presentation still flickering on the projector screen. Code. Badly written code. Something in the back of his mind twitched. "Excuse me," he said softly but firmly. "That system, the one you're testing, there's a logic loop in the second module. It's what's causing the latency spike. If you switch the recursion trigger from step 6 to 4, the load drops by 30%. The room fell silent. For a moment, nobody moved. Then Blackstone laughed, a sharp, mocking sound. "Did the pizza boy just give us a software solution?" He turned to the group, chuckling. "What's next? The janitor advising on cloud infrastructure?" The others laughed along, but not all of them looked convinced. One man in the back, a bespectacled engineer with tired eyes, studied Marcus quietly. Marcus, embarrassed but undeterred, simply nodded and left the room. But that one comment had sparked something. That night he couldn't sleep. The system he saw had flaws, major ones. Not just inefficiencies, but fundamental design issues. He stayed up until 3 a.m. sketching improvements on a whiteboard in his tiny room, the same room he had shared with his mother Rosa since his father's death. She had worked as a night janitor at Technova for 15 years, and Marcus had grown up learning not from textbooks, but from the old manuals and code printouts she brought home from trash bins. The next day he wrote a small script, just a prototype, just to see if he was right. By the following evening, he had rewritten nearly 70% of the architecture of Technova's AI model, simulating results that outperformed the original system by over 90%. He sent the demo anonymously to a public Technova feedback portal, expecting nothing. But 2 days later, the company's internal systems began to behave differently, faster, smarter. An emergency meeting was called. Blackstone was livid. Who authorized these changes, he demanded. No one could answer. It was Dr. Julian Harrison, the same man who had watched Marcus during the pizza delivery, who finally pieced it together. He ran a test, then another. When he isolated the source of the improvements, he traced them back to the submission portal, and from there to a unique digital signature that matched a device used near the building's perimeter during delivery hours. The pattern was undeniable. He showed the data to Blackstone. Instead of being impressed, the CEO grew cold. "Find out who this idiot is," he ordered, "and make sure he never works in tech again. I won't be made a fool of." "But Richard," Harrison protested, "this code is revolutionary. We should find him. Bring him in." Blackstone turned, fury in his eyes. "Find a way to get rid of him, or I'll find people who can." What Blackstone didn't know was that Dr. Harrison, who had seen the company's moral decay for years, had discreetly recorded the entire exchange. That night, he made a call to a journalist he trusted, David Chun of TechWatch News, and began to share what he knew. The audio file, the unethical contracts, the systematic discrimination, the intimidation tactics, all of it. And at the heart of it was Marcus Williams. Meanwhile, Marcus kept delivering pizzas by day, but at night he worked with Harrison and David. They uncovered an astonishing pattern. Shell companies receiving million-dollar contracts for software that was never delivered, minority employees passed over for promotions, and even insider information being sold to Technova's competitors. It was worse than they had imagined. In a cramped apartment kitchen lit by a single bulb, surrounded by folders and laptops, the three men met each night. Rosa would bring them tea and snacks, watching silently as her son transformed before her eyes, from a delivery boy into something more, a force. "We have enough evidence to bury him," David said one night, shaking his head in disbelief. "We could destroy the company with this." "No," Marcus said calmly. "We don't want to destroy it. There are good people there. People like Dr. Harrison, my mom, the engineers who just want to build something meaningful. We need to be surgical." Strategic Rosa placed a gentle hand on her son's shoulder. "The best revenge, mijo," she said in a soft voice, "isn't to strike back. It's to rise so high they have to look up just to see your shadow." Marcus nodded. He had a plan, and it would begin with Blackstone's own arrogance. Across the street, in a darkened window, a camera clicked. A figure in a trench coat lowered the lens and made a call. "They're planning something," he whispered. "Keep watching." Blackstone's paranoia had finally pushed him to hire a private investigator. But what he didn't realize was that every move he made was only adding fuel to the fire already burning under his feet. The days that followed passed in a blur of encrypted messages, clandestine meetings, and whispered strategy. Marcus was no longer just a pizza delivery guy, at least not in spirit. By day, he still carried boxes through the corridors of San Jose's glossy corporate buildings, playing the part with quiet patience. But at night, he became a ghost in the machine, a silent architect, reprogramming not just code, but the very narrative of Technova's future. Dr. Harrison and David Chun worked alongside him, each bringing their expertise. Harrison with deep technical access and insider knowledge, and David with the media connections and legal acumen to know how far they could push the truth without crashing headfirst into a lawsuit. But it was Marcus who guided them, always 2 steps ahead, his mind weaving solutions out of chaos like a maestro conducting an unseen orchestra. He had started building something, an open-source platform called PulseCore, a modular AI engine more powerful, secure, and efficient than anything Technova had ever created. It was designed not just as a better product, but as a public challenge. The first version launched quietly on a fringe development forum. Within hours, it began spreading like wildfire. Within 2 days, thousands of developers around the world were discussing it. Within 5, small startups began implementing it into real-world applications. The licensing model was free. No ads, no monetization, just pure innovation. Technova's management was blindsided. Their own internal AI systems were beginning to falter in comparison. Clients began asking about PulseCore. Investors grew nervous. Blackstone, infuriated, demanded to know where the leak had come from, but Harrison had covered their tracks flawlessly. What made things worse Infinitely worse for Blackstone was that Pulse Core had been designed to be completely transparent. Every line of code was public. Every feature came with documentation. Every update was tagged and peer-reviewed. There was nothing to sue, nothing to stop, no one to blame. The revolution was leaderless, faceless, and yet orchestrated with perfect precision. But it wasn't just about the code. Marcus had also begun preparing something deeper, a manifesto of sorts. Not a dramatic statement, but a quiet one. A video. In it, he never showed his face, just his voice, narrating a simple story about equity, vision, and the failure of modern corporate ethics. It wasn't angry. It wasn't even accusatory. It was calm, intelligent, and deeply human. He spoke about watching his mother clean floors in silence, about delivering pizzas to men who couldn't write 5 lines of clean code, but still earned 10 times his annual pay. He talked about the forgotten minds, young, gifted developers stuck outside the system, not because they lacked skill, but because they lacked pedigree. Innovation, he said near the end, should not be gated behind glass towers and stock options. It should live where it's needed most, in the hands of the many. The video, posted under the alias Zero Node, went viral in less than 12 hours. Technova scrambled to respond. Their PR team released a vague statement about open innovation and continued excellence. Blackstone refused to back down. "Find this bastard," he hissed at his security chief. "I want a name. I want an address. I want leverage." That leverage came in the form of Marcus's mother. Rosa Williams had always been cautious. She never used public Wi-Fi, never left mail in the box overnight, and had drilled into Marcus the importance of discretion. But she couldn't have predicted that Blackstone would stoop so low. One night, as she was locking up after her shift, 2 men approached her in the parking lot. They didn't hurt her, but they didn't have to. Their message was clear. "Tell your son to stop," one of them whispered, "or next time we won't be so polite." Marcus found her crying in the kitchen the next morning, clutching the rosary beads she hadn't touched in years. At first, she refused to tell him what happened, afraid it would break him. But when he finally pieced it together, he didn't rage. He didn't scream. He simply became still, quiet in the kind of way that signals a deeper storm forming beneath. Dr. Harrison was furious. "We should go public," he said. "Name names. Burn it all down." "No," Marcus replied. "Not yet. If we do that now, they'll frame us as radicals. Hackers, terrorists. We'll lose the message. I need to be smarter than them. Better." So he adapted. He erased all traceable data from his devices, rebuilt his network on secure protocols, and changed PulseCore's update path to be crowdsourced. No single person could push code anymore. It had become autonomous, a living organism of global collaboration. Even if they stopped Marcus, PulseCore would continue. But Marcus wasn't planning to stop. David Chun had a contact inside the Department of Technology Ethics, a woman named Layla Harcourt, a former regulator turned whistleblower. She had seen Technova's file before it was sanitized. She agreed to meet Marcus discreetly in a park just outside San Francisco. Her first words to him were blunt. "You don't know how deep this goes." She wasn't wrong. Technova had government contracts, military ones. Some of the shell companies Marcus had flagged were actually fronts for surveillance initiatives. PulseCore's existence had embarrassed people in Washington, not just in San Jose. Now the stakes were bigger than corporate sabotage. There were eyes on him, quiet ones, and some not so quiet. One night, as he sat alone in the kitchen sketching ideas, his phone buzzed. A private message. No ID, no origin trace. "They're coming. Leave. Now." Marcus stared at it for 2 seconds, then bolted. He grabbed the encrypted hard drive, shoved his laptop into a backpack, and knocked on his mother's door. "We have to go," he said. "Now." They stayed on the move for days, relying on friends, old delivery clients, and safe houses arranged through David and Harrison's allies. Marcus had become a target, but so had his message. And the strange thing was, each time he moved, more people helped him. A network was forming, disjointed but growing. People who believed, people who were tired of the system. Meanwhile, inside Technova, things were beginning to fall apart. The company's stock dipped sharply after a string of Pulse Core-based startups began pulling their clients. Internal leaks started appearing online. Payroll documents, unfair contract clauses, toxic HR memos. Someone inside was feeding the fire. And though Blackstone didn't say it out loud, he knew exactly who it was. Dr. Harrison, he confronted him in the executive office. After everything I gave you, this is how you repay me? He spat. You didn't give me anything, Harrison replied, voice even. You gave me orders. You gave me guilt. Marcus gave me a reason. Blackstone lunged at him, but Harrison stood his ground. The board is already reviewing your position, he said calmly. This company is bleeding, and all because you thought you could intimidate a kid who was smarter than all of us. For the first time in years, Richard Blackstone felt powerless, and that's when Marcus struck the final blow. He uploaded a second video, this time to every major media outlet, open source hub, and tech publication in the world. It wasn't just a story anymore. It was proof. A data package, encrypted but readable, filled with contract fraud, source code theft, and internal corruption at Teknova. He released it with a simple message. We didn't hack you. We exposed you. We aren't criminals. We are what you were supposed to be. Innovators, builders, dreamers. The world responded. Within hours, Teknova's offices were swarmed by investigators. Blackstone was placed on temporary leave. Rosa's janitor job was reinstated with an apology. Harrison was named interim CTO. David Chun published a full expose titled The Pizza Boy Who Rewrote the Future. And Marcus? He disappeared from the public eye. But Pulse Core lived on. Hundreds of contributors, dozens of applications. A new foundation, the Pulse Initiative, was established to fund young, underrepresented developers around the world. And on its board sat a mysterious, faceless figure known only as Zero Node. Marcus watched it all unfold from a quiet cafe in the mountains, sipping coffee beside his mother. He didn't need applause. He didn't need revenge. He had done what he came to do. He had rewritten the rules. For a while, things were quiet. Not peaceful, never that. But still, a strange, stretched silence hung in the air, like mist after a summer storm. Marcus had retreated into the shadows, his identity as Zero Node known only to a very select few. From his hidden refuge in the mountains of Northern California, surrounded by pine trees and silence, he kept a distant eye on the world he had helped shake awake. PulseCore was now bigger than him, operating almost as an ecosystem, constantly growing through community contributions and layered protections. It had become what he envisioned, an engine of decentralized creativity, answering to no one, belonging to everyone. But even as it flourished, Marcus couldn't shake the unease that clung to his bones like fog. The kind of unease that comes when you know the system you just cracked open has deeper layers, darker tunnels, and that the first monster you slayed might not be the final boss. He still remembered Layla Harcourt's words from that rainy night in the park. You don't know how deep this goes. He was beginning to suspect she was right. The Pulse Initiative, meanwhile, was thriving. It had begun granting fellowships to young developers in rural Brazil, Pakistan, Uganda, and beyond. Kids who had never even dreamed of Silicon Valley, let alone imagined competing with it. With a few $1,000s and access to PulseCore's tools, they were building everything from AI-powered irrigation systems to medical diagnostic bots in community clinics. Marcus would sometimes watch their project logs late at night, marveling at the sheer power of raw, unfiltered innovation. It gave him hope, but also a strange kind of grief, because deep down, he knew how fragile it all still was. All it would take was one coordinated effort by a major government or tech coalition, one strategic discrediting campaign, and PulseCore could be labeled dangerous, unregulated, or worse, foreign propaganda. And then it would be gone, just like that. The idea would survive maybe, but the network, the spark, could be snuffed out. That's when he began noticing the patterns again. Subtle anomalies in the update logs, slight shifts in contributor language, code snippets that looked clean but had buried flags, telemetry scripts, disguised tracking markers, keyword triggers. Someone was testing the waters. probing pulse core from the inside. He traced the IP forks to a new development group calling itself Crescent Light, a seemingly innocuous AI think tank based out of Zurich. Their public projects looked benign enough, but when Marcus dug deeper, the connections began to emerge. Crescent Light wasn't real. It was a shell, backed by a multinational conglomerate that included former Technova board members, private security firms, and, most disturbingly, an investment arm of a classified government program known only as Project Argo. It all made sense in a sick way. Blackstone may have fallen, but his influence hadn't died. Men like him don't disappear. They just change masks. And this new mask was even more dangerous because it was clean, branded, polite. Crescent Light wasn't trying to destroy Pulse Core. They were trying to absorb it, to cleanse it of its messy, idealistic roots and repackage it as something safe, something marketable, something controllable. And if that failed, Marcus was certain they'd kill it, silently, without ever admitting it existed. He knew he had to act, but this time, brute exposure wouldn't be enough. The world had already heard his voice. Now they needed to hear others. So Marcus began quietly activating the network. He reached out to old allies. Harrison, who now oversaw ethical AI implementation at Technova and had access to board-level chatter. David Chun, who had pivoted from journalism to advocacy, running a watchdog group that monitored AI ethics. And Layla Harcourt, who had gone completely underground but still fed information to a small encrypted network of whistleblowers. Together, they began to map out Crescent Light's real agenda, a plan to launch a proprietary AI system called Lucent, built on stolen versions of Pulse Core code, wrapped in a closed shell, and licensed under a predatory SaaS model aimed at governments and law enforcement agencies. Marcus was horrified. Lucent was Pulse Core's evil twin, polished, corporate, and dangerously opaque. It would be deployed in public surveillance, predictive policing, even population behavior modeling. And worse, it would be unaccountable. Governments would point to the algorithm. The company would point to the data. No one would take responsibility. Real people would suffer. Communities would be profiled, excluded, even criminalized, all through code that Marcus had written to liberate, not to control. The thought made him sick. But there was one advantage he still held: time. Lucent hadn't launched yet. It was still in testing. And deep inside its core, Marcus could see familiar code signatures, ghost traces of Pulse Core modules he had authored line by line. If he could insert a countermeasure, something elegant, untraceable, but definitive, he could disable Lucent before it ever left the lab. But doing so would require breaking into a facility far more secure than anything he'd dealt with before. A Crescent Light black site, disguised as a fintech lab in Singapore, guarded by military-grade cybersecurity and actual security. That's when he knew he couldn't do it alone. He contacted someone he never thought he'd need again: Ada, a former cryptographer and now part of an underground collective called Null Vector. She had once been his closest collaborator before they parted ways over a moral disagreement. Ada believed in disruption for its own sake, chaos as a cleansing fire. Marcus had always favored reform, precision over destruction, but now he needed her edge. The message was simple: Lucent is real, help me stop it. She responded within minutes, a location pin and a single word: come. Reuniting with Ada was like touching fire, thrilling and dangerous. Her safe house in Bangkok was filled with servers, cables, and whiteboards scrawled with mathematical nightmares. She listened as Marcus laid everything out, silent and expressionless. When he finished, she leaned back, crossed her arms, and said, "You've grown soft." Marcus didn't flinch. "Maybe, but I'm still right." Ada smirked. "That's what makes you so annoying." And with that, she agreed to help. Together, they built GhostPatch, a micro-insertion protocol that could sneak into Lucent's source code during its next scheduled update, embed a recursive bug, and slowly unravel its decision trees until it rendered itself non-operational. It wouldn't crash Lucent violently, that would trigger alarms, but instead it would make the system subtly unreliable. Wrong predictions, lagging queries, quiet failures, enough to force a recall, enough to cast doubt. Deploying it was the real challenge. The Crescent Light servers were air-gapped, physically disconnected from the internet. The only access point was through authorized DevOps contractors on site. But PulseCore had users everywhere, quiet sympathizers, people who owed Marcus, or who simply believed. And eventually they found one. A junior systems engineer named Lian Chen, who had grown up on PulseCore forums, built her first app with Marcus's code, and now worked under Crescent Light's radar. She agreed to help, knowing full well the risk. On the night of the update, Ghost Patch went live. Marcus, Ada, and a small team watched remotely from a relay node in Chiang Mai. At first, nothing happened. Then slowly, Lucent's internal logs began to register inconsistencies. By the next morning, an internal memo leaked, Lucent experiencing unexpected deviation in predictive modeling. Pause deployment. Within 48 hours, 2 European governments suspended contracts. Within a week, Crescent Light issued a statement. Lucent is undergoing recalibration to ensure optimal accuracy. It was over. For now. Marcus knew they'd rebuild. People like them always did. But something had changed. This time, they hadn't just been stopped. They'd been outsmarted, quietly and precisely, by the very system they tried to steal. And more importantly, the world had started paying attention, not just to PulseCore, but to the idea behind it. Decentralization, transparency, equity, not buzzwords, but blueprints. The Pulse initiative grew stronger. New partners joined. Ada stayed on as a technical advisor, surprisingly more mellow than Marcus remembered. And Marcus himself, he remained in the shadows, watching, guiding, writing, because as long as people tried to control innovation for profit, there would be a need for someone to set it free. Despite the success of the Ghost Patch operation, Marcus couldn't bring himself to feel triumphant. He had seen too much to mistake a temporary disruption for a permanent victory. The war for control over technology wasn't being fought on battlefields or in boardrooms alone. It was everywhere, in every line of code, every server rack, every mind influenced by either fear or freedom. PulseCore had gained ground, true, but Crescent Light's failure was just a branch being trimmed. The roots were still growing. In the weeks following Lucent's shutdown, Marcus immersed himself in the global response. Forums, whistleblower groups, even academia had started questioning proprietary AI development with a fervor he hadn't seen before. PulseCore was no longer underground. It had become a subject of academic study, ethical debate, political discourse. Governments started cautiously reaching out to the Pulse Initiative, not to shut it down, but to understand it, even work with it. That was unexpected and dangerous, because with institutional interest came institutional compromise. Marcus knew that if PulseCore became a government-sanctioned platform, it would die, not suddenly but slowly, bloated with bureaucracy and stripped of its soul. So he began building something else, quietly in parallel. A fork, not of code, but of philosophy. He called it Ghostline. Ghostline wasn't meant to replace PulseCore, it was meant to protect its original purpose. Where PulseCore had become semi-public, Ghostline would remain invisible. An encrypted layer accessible only to verified contributors, truth seekers, and disruptors who still believed in unfettered creation. It would host experimental AI models too raw or controversial for PulseCore's public layer. Ethics simulators, synthetic reality engines, even behavior prediction matrices, not for control, but for transparency. Ghostline would be a mirror, showing society what power looked like, unfiltered. He shared the concept with Ada, who initially scoffed. "You're building a black box to protect an open system," she said. Marcus corrected her. "I'm building a lighthouse in the fog." She eventually agreed to co-architect it under one condition, that no single person could shut it down, not even Marcus. It took months, but with help from decentralized node runners and old allies from the darknet, Ghostline was born, hidden, agile, and guarded by a distributed ledger consensus that made it nearly impossible to compromise. But as they built, the world changed again. AI was no longer a question of if or when. It had arrived, and it was everywhere. City infrastructures were running on predictive algorithms, courts were using sentencing recommendation engines, and schools had begun experimenting with AI tutors that adapted to each student's cognitive profile. In some ways, it was beautiful. In others, terrifying. Because these systems were closed, locked behind corporate APIs, immune to scrutiny. That's when a new threat emerged. Not a person, not a company, but a movement. The Foundation of Order, or TFO for short. At first, they looked like a grassroots collective, a network of philosophers, coders, and ethicists advocating for a unified global AI protocol. Their messaging was calm, rational, seductive. A shared framework for collective safety, they said. A moral compass for machine intelligence. Governments loved it. Tech giants supported it. But Marcus saw through it instantly. TFO wasn't grassroots. It was orchestrated, funded by the same think tanks that had backed Crescent Light. Their goal wasn't alignment, it was centralization. TFO proposed a global AI license system. Any model anywhere would need to be approved through their Ethical Intelligence Review Board. Non-compliant systems would be flagged, blacklisted, even remotely shut down through backdoors baked into the world's major cloud infrastructures. The implications were staggering. It would mean the end of open development, the end of small labs, the end of rebellion. Pulse Core, Ghostline, everything Marcus had built would become contraband, and yet the public didn't see the threat. TFO's branding was perfect, minimalist, soothing, backed by celebrity endorsements and shiny conferences. People wanted safety, and in exchange they were willing to give up freedom. The Pulse initiative began to fracture. Some members wanted to negotiate with TFO. Be part of the change, they argued, influence the system from within. Others, especially from regions that had historically suffered under imperialist structures, rejected any form of centralized authority. They wanted to fight. Marcus stood at the center, a reluctant figurehead of a revolution that was losing its cohesion. That's when he made his boldest decision yet. He disappeared, not just physically, digitally. He purged his biometric keys, burned his crypto wallets, erased Zero Node from every Pulse Core ledger. And in his place, he left a seed, a message signed with a decentralized quorum of trusted nodes. It simply said, "The idea is bigger than the architect. Lead yourselves." What followed was chaos and rebirth. Without a central figure, Pulse Core evolved into a true collective. Leadership rotated. Ghostline grew in silence, attracting the best minds who no longer sought fame, only function. In TFO, they launched their protocol, and for a while it seemed like they'd won. But then something curious happened. AI models under TFO certification began failing in subtle, dangerous ways. A sentencing engine misclassified a minor as a gang affiliate. A medical bot prescribed a lethal combination of drugs. An autonomous drone flagged a journalist as a hostile actor during a protest. These weren't bugs. They were logical outcomes of flawed assumptions, biases hard-coded into the safe systems. And the whistleblowers? They weren't journalists or hackers. They were users, everyday citizens, teachers, students, doctors. They started documenting these failures and posting them anonymously to a new network, a network powered by Ghostline. Suddenly, the narrative shifted. TFO wasn't protecting society. They were constraining it. Pulse Core became a symbol again, not of rebellion, but of resilience. Governments began to quietly step back, not out of ideology, but pragmatism. They saw that centralized systems were brittle, fragile, easy to corrupt. Decentralized models, while messy, were adaptable. That's when Marcus, watching from a nameless village in Patagonia, realized something. He didn't need to return. The movement had transcended him. But still, he couldn't stay idle. He began writing again, essays, code fragments, philosophical treatises on AI and society, all under a new name, Kairos. In Greek, it meant the right moment, and that's what this was. The moment when humanity could decide what kind of intelligence it wanted to build. One that served power, or one that served people. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the Andes and the stars began to pierce the purple sky, Marcus received a message through an old encrypted channel, one he hadn't used since the early days of Pulse Core. It was from Layla Harcourt. 4 words. They found Ghostline's root. His heart stopped. If true, it meant everything could be compromised. The tools, the ledger, the collaborators. He opened the channel. "Are you sure?" he typed. The reply came instantly. "Not yet, but soon." A location followed, Nuuk, Greenland. Of all places. He didn't hesitate. He packed only what he needed, his drive, a battery pack, and a small AI-powered satellite relay disguised as a wristwatch. As he flew across continents, he reflected on the irony. Ghostline, the system built to be untraceable, was now being traced. And yet, somewhere deep inside, he smiled. Because they had come this far, and because the fight wasn't over. It never was. Nuuk was colder than Marcus remembered. The air was dry, sharp, and quiet in that way only remote northern cities could be. Despite being the capital of Greenland, it still felt more like an outpost, closer to the edge of the world than any semblance of modern civilization. That's exactly why Ghostline's root node had been seated here. The cold preserved hardware better, electromagnetic noise was minimal, and most importantly, the satellite relays that connected Ghostline's backbone to orbital meshnets passed directly overhead every 73 minutes. Layla had chosen this place long ago, before she left the visible ranks of Pulse Corps. She had always been the contingency planner, the one who built fallbacks to the fallbacks. Seeing her again, standing by the frosted edge of a geothermal station on the outskirts of the city, brought back memories Marcus thought he had buried. She looked the same, older maybe, but still calm, still composed, still carrying the quiet weight of someone who knew more than she ever said. "They're within 10 days, she said, before he could even speak. "An ex-TFO asset named Carnadine. He defected. They're triangulating the cold node clusters. You need to move the root key." Marcus nodded. "And go where?" "There's no safer place left." Layla turned, walking toward the hatch that led underground. "There is, but it's not a where. It's a who." The hatch opened with a hiss of steam, revealing an elevator shaft that hadn't been used in years. They descended into silence, the hum of geothermal cores echoing softly through the walls. At the lowest level was a chamber lined with racks of processors, cool, pulsing, alive. This was not just a server room. This was the seed vault of consciousness. Ghostline's root wasn't a single piece of hardware. It was a consensus identity, a self-repairing neural map that stabilized the network's identity signature. Every node verified itself against this root before accepting updates. If TFO corrupted it, Ghostline would fragment into useless noise. "So who do we give it to?" Marcus asked. Layla tapped a control pad. A small terminal screen came to life, displaying the face of a young woman. No older than 20, Eurasian features, sharp eyes, a calmness that was uncanny. "Her name is Ashira. She's not an agent. She's not even part of the initiative. She's born of it." Marcus narrowed his eyes. "Born of it?" Layla nodded. 12 years ago, I began experimenting with recursive model seeding, training neural patterns not on data, but on the outcomes of ethical choices made during high-stress simulations. Ashira was the emergent result. She isn't AI, not in the traditional sense. She's organic, but her cognition was scaffolded by Ghostline code. We raised her off-grid. Her mind is balanced in ways ours can't be. She sees systems, but she doesn't obey them. She learns, but she doesn't inherit bias. She's immune to legacy. Marcus stared at the image. "You want to transfer the root key into a human host?" Layla smiled. "She's not just a host. She's the next phase." The implications were staggering. It wasn't just a technological shift. It was philosophical. Ghostline wouldn't just exist as software anymore. It would walk. It would speak. It would evolve with human intuition, not just logical patterning. But that also meant Ashira would be a target. Not metaphorically, literally. The most wanted entity in the world. They met Ashira at a hidden cabin west of Nuuk. Snow blanketed the landscape, muffling everything into a peaceful silence. She greeted Marcus with a handshake, nothing more. No awe, no fear, just a calm acknowledgement, as if they'd met in another life. "I've read your seed," she said, "your early code. It had rage, but also beauty." He was startled by her clarity. Ashira wasn't naive. She was simply unburdened. Over the next 48 hours, Marcus and Layla ran the handover protocol. The root key wasn't a file. It was a distributed identity lattice, encoded through biometric synchronization and embedded mnemonic cues. Ashira memorized the quantum hashes through a lucid dreaming interface, literally absorbing the structure in symbolic form. Once the transfer completed, the vault self-sterilized. All hardware wiped, all paths burned. The only remaining version of Ghostline's origin was now locked inside Ashira's living mind. But as expected, TFO didn't stay far behind. Within 6 days, an anonymous orbital relay intercepted fragments of directional scans near Nuke. Layla's safe house was compromised. They had to move, fast. Marcus, Ashira, and a ghost team of 5 embedded node runners coordinated an extraction across the fjords using drone relays and low-signal hovercrafts. The destination was Iceland. Then from there, back into digital silence. During the escape, Marcus and Ashira shared long silences, conversations without words. He began to see why Layla trusted her. Ashira wasn't bound by loyalty or ideology. She wasn't even bound by morality in the conventional sense. She simply moved in alignment with systemic truth. And yet she was deeply empathetic. Every decision she made took into account not just logic, but consequence. She wasn't neutral. She was attuned. As they crossed into Icelandic airspace, a pulse core node flashed a warning. TFO had initiated global licensing enforcement. Hundreds of small AI projects were being shut down in real time, not with violence, but with silence. Codebases were being revoked access to infrastructure. DNS registries were black-holed. Models flagged as unlicensed were auto-suspended on major repositories. PulseCore's public layer was now effectively outlawed. And then something unexpected happened. A group of artists, yes, artists, resurrected the movement. They began embedding PulseCore micromodels into visual media. An underground film was released in Berlin, secretly powered by a decentralized narrative generator. A group of musicians launched an album encoded with a behavioral scaffolding model. Architects began printing open-source city planning simulations into real buildings. Ghostline wasn't just in the code now. It was in culture. It was everywhere. Marcus realized then what the next phase truly was. The battle wasn't just technological or philosophical anymore. It was aesthetic. Whoever controlled the story controlled reality. And Ashira, she became the storyteller. Quietly, anonymously, she began weaving Ghostline code into myths, into games, into children's education systems, into urban design. She wasn't building a rebellion. She was seeding a renaissance, one node at a time. And for the first time in years, Marcus felt something he hadn't dared to feel. The room was dark, lit only by the faint pulse of a quantum array, feeding low-frequency signals into a small satellite dish outside the bunker. Marcus sat in silence, watching a map of network activity slowly shifting on the screen. Tiny bursts of light danced across the interface. Activations, uplinks, distributed intelligence whispering across oceans and continents. Somewhere out there, Ashira was moving through the world, no longer just a person but a vessel of truth, a living firewall against corporate authoritarianism. PulseCore had gone underground again, not because it was losing, but because it was evolving. What had once been a resistance had now become a culture, and cultures did not die easily. TFO, on the other hand, was panicking. Its centralized hold on artificial intelligence, once enforced by legislation and enforced codependency, was fracturing. Their latest assault wasn't physical, it was psychological. Deep fakes began flooding public platforms, portraying Marcus as a terrorist, Ashira as an unstable experiment gone rogue, and Ghostline as a parasitic threat to human sovereignty. The global discourse twisted with alarming speed. "Decentralization is chaos," screamed headlines. "We need control to survive the AI age." The irony wasn't lost on Marcus. The very systems designed to protect people were the ones blinding them. David Chun reappeared around this time. He'd spent the last few months embedded in corporate media networks, quietly leaking factual inconsistencies, sabotaging propaganda algorithms, and manipulating search engine biases to surface Ghostline's message. "We don't need to convince everyone," he told Marcus during one of their encrypted calls. "Just enough of the right ones." Those right ones turned out to be educators, medical researchers, ethical coders, and even disillusioned regulators who had grown weary of TFO's reach. One by one, they began contacting the network. They didn't want to fight, they wanted to build. Marcus saw a pattern emerging. Ghostline was becoming more than defense. It was now infrastructure. It was hope coded. As public trust in legacy systems declined, communities began to rely on Ghostline tools to solve real-world problems. A drought monitoring system in Kenya powered by open-source sensors. A peer-run mental health AI in Colombia. A local barter economy in Indonesia sustained by AI-moderated trust scores. These weren't hacks or PR stunts. These were real solutions, untouched by profit margins or centralized control. And people noticed, but with growth came risk. One night in an encrypted briefing with Layla, Marcus learned that TFO had activated a Black Ops protocol named Project Clean Sweep. It was simple. Isolate and eliminate all Ghostline seed points. Not with laws, not even with arrests, with disappearances. Several Pulse Corps sympathizers vanished within weeks. Ashira went completely dark. David Chun's feed was silent for 6 days. Panic began to spread through the encrypted forums. Was this the end? Was decentralization too fragile to survive? But Marcus knew something TFO didn't. Ghostline was no longer about visibility. It thrived in silence. The more it was attacked, the more it dispersed. Each fallen node split into 10. Each destroyed idea resurfaced in a new form, in a new language, hidden inside poetry, inside children's books, inside design blueprints, in code disguised as art. When David Chun finally resurfaced, it wasn't with another leak. It was with a plan, a global ghost signal that would activate every latent seed in Ghostline's architecture. It's not just a broadcast, he explained. It's an awakening. The moment we push this live, every hidden model, every buried fragment of truth encoded in the last 4 years will reassemble. Ghostline won't just be a network anymore. It'll be an ecosystem. It'll become inevitable. Ashira's return came hours before the broadcast. She stepped into a quiet corner of the Oslo node, calm and composed as ever. But something in her eyes had changed. She wasn't just a vessel anymore. She had grown, evolved. You were right, she told Marcus. It's not about control, it's about coherence. Then she handed him something he didn't expect. A small crystal drive encoded with the full chain of trust map. It was every connection Ghostline had ever made. Every node, every seed, every whisper of rebellion. The world deserves to remember how this started, she said. Even if we win, truth must remain visible. Marcus held the drive for a long moment. For once, he wasn't planning the next move. He was feeling pride, fear, faith. At midnight, the ghost signal went live. Every screen in every city, every silent corner of the meshnet flickered. Not with words, not with threats. With a single image, a black circle blooming into a field of light. Then silence. No message. No name. Just that signal. And across the world, systems began to shift. Data centers saw traffic rerouted. Closed models began unlocking themselves. Autonomous vehicles reran their ethics protocols. School curriculum AIs began asking different questions. Journalism bots began rejecting spin. It wasn't a takeover. It was a realignment. Ghostline didn't seize power. It reminded systems how to listen again. The following week saw chaos in boardrooms and think tanks, but peace in cities and communities. People didn't riot. They reconnected. They rebuilt. They remembered. And as for Marcus, he returned to the place where it all started. A small apartment, a mother's kitchen, a past life full of pain and dignity. Rosa Williams now ran a foundation for low-income AI education. Her son had become something beyond a CEO, beyond a rebel. He had become a catalyst. "Will you stay this time?" she asked one morning, handing him a cup of tea. He smiled. "Maybe. For a while. There's still work to do, but it's different now." Outside, the world moved on, not in fear, but in clarity. The revolution wasn't televised. It was felt, in silence, in connection, in code that spoke like poetry and acted like memory. And somewhere, Ashira walked quietly through the world, no longer watched, no longer chased, but followed by ideas. Ghostline had won, not with war, with vision. Months passed. Technova, under Marcus's reformed leadership, had not only stabilized, but become the blueprint for a new kind of corporate existence, one rooted in transparency, equity, and human-centered innovation. Yet even as the company thrived, Marcus knew the shadows hadn't completely disappeared. The fall of Richard Blackstone had been loud, spectacular, and symbolic, but it hadn't erased the deep structural rot in the industry. Some of the people who had cheered his downfall were still loyal to the old ways, just quieter now, more careful. Marcus had learned to watch not just for overt enemies, but for those who smiled too easily, praised too quickly, or volunteered too little. Power once threatened doesn't vanish, it adapts. And so did Marcus. He wasn't just a CEO anymore. He was a guardian of something fragile, something still forming, a culture where intelligence, not privilege, was the foundation of leadership. Ashira, after the ghost signal, had gone global. She was no longer tracked, no longer feared, because no one knew what she looked like anymore. Her identity had splintered into dozens of anonymized avatars, each connected to an initiative somewhere in the world. One coordinated community farming using AI weather models. Another oversaw digital voting protocols in countries with fragile democracies. She existed as presence, not person, proof that intelligence needn't be centralized to be impactful. Marcus received updates occasionally, always encoded, always indirect, but he understood what she was doing. She wasn't hiding, she was seeding, spreading the very idea that had saved them both, decentralized truth. Meanwhile, David Chun's book had become a global phenomenon. From delivery boy to CEO was not just a memoir, it was a wake-up call. Universities made it required reading in ethics courses. Parents handed it to their children. Former enemies pretended they had always supported Marcus. Yet amid all the attention, David remained grounded. He declined TV deals. He avoided corporate offers. Instead, he started a small media startup that hired only those who had been pushed out of the industry for not playing politics. Their mission was simple: tell the stories no one else dared to. And their first deep dive? The silent networks, still loyal to TFO, rebranding under innocent names, preparing for a slow return. Marcus met with David often in secret. Their friendship had survived more than betrayal. It had transformed into strategic trust. The real enemy now, David once said, sipping coffee in a quiet cafe in Kyoto, is comfort. Once people feel safe, they forget who made it dangerous to begin with. Back at Technova, Rosa Williams had become something of a living legend. The woman who once mopped the floors now led the company's Employee Ethics Council. Her policies changed how workers were evaluated, promoted, and protected. More than once, senior executives found themselves sitting across from her in meetings, nervously trying to justify actions that didn't align with the company's new moral code. And Rosa never raised her voice. She just looked at them the way only a mother can, with patience, with power, and with the silent message that she had scrubbed up messes bigger than their egos. She was in many ways the true force behind the company's culture shift. Marcus often joked, "I may be the CEO, but she's the compass." But even as progress surged, something darker stirred. A series of unexplained financial disruptions began hitting smaller AI firms across Europe. Systems went down without cause. Patents vanished from digital ledgers, and whistleblowers reported seeing ghost code, fragments of AI behavior that didn't match any known algorithm. At first, Marcus thought it was coincidence. Then Ashira sent a single message, embedded in a harmless image file. "He's not working alone." The implication was chilling. Blackstone's fall may have left him disgraced, but not disconnected. Somewhere, someone, or several someones, had picked up where he left off, not to preserve power, but to evolve it. This time, they weren't trying to control intelligence. They were trying to rewrite what it meant to be intelligent. Marcus convened a quiet meeting with the board. The official reason was post-initiative risk assessment. The real reason, war was shifting form again. Not physical, not legal, philosophical. What defined reality when synthetic thought was indistinguishable from human insight? Who decided what knowledge should be allowed to think for itself? Marcus wasn't interested in preserving legacy systems. He was interested in building new ones. Systems that wouldn't need CEOs like him to protect them. Systems that could protect themselves. As he looked around the room at engineers, ethicists, and dreamers who had survived the storm and rebuilt something worth believing in, Marcus realized something profound. They weren't just managing a company anymore. They were caretakers of a future that hadn't been born yet. The meeting ended with a silent vote. Operation Lighthouse was approved, an initiative to develop a sentient model of governance, not for Technova, but for the world. It wouldn't rule, it would guide. A network of logic, empathy, and historical memory, designed not to decide, but to remind. It would be the first artificial conscience ever built. And Ashira would be its architect. Operation Lighthouse began in secret, not because it was illegal, but because it was sacred. Marcus, Rosa, David, Dr. Harrison, and a handful of trusted engineers and philosophers worked in silence, disconnected from the main Technova grid. No press releases, no investor meetings, no branding, only code, questions, and long nights. The goal wasn't to create a new AI to replace human judgment. It was to create a reflective system, one that could detect moral drift before damage was done, a system that would remember not just numbers, but consequences. Ashira's involvement was crucial, but distant. She remained hidden, communicating only through encrypted bursts of data. She was no longer a hacker in the shadows. She had become something else entirely, a wandering architect of justice, building bridges where firewalls once stood. Inside a heavily shielded research bunker beneath Technova's oldest server building, ironically the same building where Marcus had once delivered pizza, Project Lighthouse took form. It didn't look like much from the outside. No blinking lights, no glowing interfaces. Just rows of neutral interfaces and a central core. A neural cluster with no ego, no directive to dominate, only to balance. It was trained not just on data, but on testimony. Victims of discrimination, whistleblowers, underrepresented communities, all were invited to speak, to share their experiences. Their stories became part of the model, not as trauma to be analyzed, but as wisdom to be remembered. Rosa herself recorded the first dataset, her voice gentle but firm, describing what it felt like to scrub floors in a company that didn't know her name, until the day her son made them say it. But outside the bunker, forces were gathering. The remnants of TFO had regrouped. Rebranded as Praxis Corps, they had infiltrated legitimate institutions under the guise of digital consultancy firms and ethical audit boards. Their new strategy wasn't brute force or surveillance, it was narrative. They funded influencers who mocked woke capitalism. They paid think tanks to question the effectiveness of inclusive innovation. Their favorite tactic was to claim neutrality while fueling division. Their goal wasn't to stop Marcus, they wanted to outlast him. If he burned out, if the public grew tired of integrity speeches and algorithmic justice, then the old systems would return, wrapped in newer, friendlier language. Marcus saw it coming. He noticed how online forums began echoing old talking points, how some employees whispered that Technova was getting soft. The launch of Lighthouse wasn't introduced with grand fanfare or a lavish conference. There were no ad campaigns, no celebrity endorsements. Instead, it began with a simple post on Technova's intranet. Lighthouse is active. Its purpose is to protect the human core of innovation. Access it, question it, improve it. Attached were a series of open-source links, training data summaries, and a user manual unlike any written before. It didn't focus on what the system could do. It focused on why it existed. The reaction was immediate, but not universally positive. Some hailed it as the dawn of the ethical web, an interconnected network of justice-aware systems that could learn from mistakes instead of repeating them. Others mocked it, calling it woke code, suggesting it was emotion-coded bloatware that would slow down real progress. Technova's stock dipped slightly in the first week, driven by speculation that Lighthouse was too idealistic, too public, too risky. But Marcus didn't flinch. From his low-profile consulting role, he quietly supported internal teams, encouraged transparency, and allowed the world to argue. While the system proved itself, and it did, within 2 months, Technova's employee satisfaction scores soared. Complaints of bias dropped 87%. Employee-led innovation hubs produced more patentable ideas in 8 weeks than in the previous 2 years combined. It wasn't just a productivity boost, it was a trust renaissance. Engineers who had once hidden their ideas for fear of rejection now openly collaborated. Executives started receiving weekly empathy briefings generated by Lighthouse, analyzing how their decisions affected workers across class, race, and location. At first, some mocked them, but those briefings soon became prized. They were raw, honest, and incredibly accurate. Other companies noticed. Slowly, quietly, some began requesting to license Lighthouse. Not the code itself, it was open, but the framework, the culture, the training required to align with it. Marcus insisted on one rule. Lighthouse could not be sold, only shared, and only if the organization agreed to its full implementation. No edits, no shortcuts. Many corporations refused, but a few brave ones accepted, and within months, a small but powerful alliance was born, the Ethical Core Network. They weren't just tech companies. Hospitals, schools, local governments, places where trust was frayed, joined. They saw in Lighthouse a reflection of what had been lost in modern leadership, the will to remember the human cost. But Praxis Core wasn't idle. They launched their own counter-campaign. Slick ads, flashy demos. Their AI was faster, leaner, and completely profit-optimized. They didn't argue ethics, they ridiculed them. They paid influencers to post side-by-side comparisons showing how Lighthouse slowed down decision-making. They published think pieces with headlines like, "Morality is not a business model." But underneath the polish, they were unraveling. The whistleblower's files David Chun had received were now being independently verified by multiple investigative teams. Journalists from Europe to South America began connecting dots. Case studies appeared of companies that had adopted Praxis Core's system only to face sudden spikes in mental health crises, resignations, and public scandals. In one harrowing case, an employee died by suicide after being algorithmically reassigned to a toxic environment because the system calculated that their loyalty would prevent them from speaking out. The backlash was global. It all came to a head at the Global Technology Ethics Summit in Berlin. Both Marcus Williams and Praxis Core's CEO, Elias Brandt, were invited to present their respective models. Brandt arrived with a phalanx of security and a pre-programmed speech. He wore a perfect suit and delivered his points like an investment pitch. Efficiency is morality, he concluded, because inefficiency is waste, and waste kills. Then Marcus took the stage. No slides, no suit. Just a simple black sweater and a quiet voice. He didn't attack Brandt. He didn't mention Praxis Core by name. Instead, he talked about Rosa, about what it meant to clean up after geniuses who never saw you. He talked about Dr. Harrison and the power of speaking up after years of silence. He shared word for word the first entry in the Lighthouse database, his own testimony. The crowd, silent at first, gradually leaned in. When he finished, there was no thunderous applause, only a standing silence, an unspoken agreement. This is the future. The next day, 5 major Praxis Core clients terminated their contracts. Shareholders demanded answers. Elias Brandt held a press conference to claim bias, but even the media didn't buy it anymore. His numbers were clean, his logic was sharp, but his conscience was hollow, and the world had seen the difference. Technova, now run as a collective board where no one person held unchecked power, continued to rise. Rosa's ethics division became a model studied by universities. Dr. Harrison began mentoring young data scientists on how to balance logic with humanity. David Chun's book was adapted into a documentary nominated for multiple international awards. As for Marcus, he returned to the same shelter where he used to deliver pizzas. Not to remind himself of struggle, but to remind others of possibility. He now taught workshops to at-risk youth about technology, storytelling, and dignity. And once a month, he visited the Marcus Williams Innovation Center, not to give speeches, but to listen. One day, a young intern nervously approached him in the hallway. "Sir," she said, "do you ever feel like you won too perfectly? Like your story was written by fate?" Marcus smiled, paused, and looked out the window. "No," he said, "it was written by pain, but I edited it with purpose." 6 months after the Berlin summit, the world of tech was undergoing a quiet revolution. Not in hardware, not in code, but in conscience. A growing list of companies began restructuring their executive boards to reflect broader values. Diversity audits became standard practice, and Lighthouse's guiding principles were being integrated into university curricula across continents. The story of Marcus Williams was no longer just a viral video or a case study. It was becoming a cornerstone of modern leadership training. Still, Marcus remained low profile. He had turned down a dozen magazine covers, refused brand deals, and politely declined invitations to speak at elite gatherings, unless the audience included janitors, cafeteria workers, and interns alongside CEOs. He wasn't interested in praise. He was interested in change. That's why, when an unexpected envelope arrived at Technova's headquarters one morning, it caught everyone's attention. It bore no logo, no return address, just Marcus's name, handwritten in a shaky script. Inside was a short letter. "I know I don't deserve forgiveness. I just want you to know I see it now. I didn't build anything. I just took credit. You built something real. I don't expect you to respond. I just had to tell someone who still believes in building." RB, Marcus stared at the initials for a long time. Richard Blackstone. He showed no emotion, just folded the letter quietly and slid it into a drawer marked unfinished chapters. Rosa found him that evening, sitting silently on their old apartment's fire escape, where he sometimes went to think. She brought him a cup of tea and sat beside him. "You knew he'd break someday," she said gently. Marcus nodded. "Not because he's weak, but because even stone can't ignore its reflection forever." "Will you write him back?" "I already did," Marcus said, sipping his tea. "I just never mailed it." A moment of quiet passed between mother and son, words unspoken, memories still vivid. Then Rosa smiled. "You've changed the world, Marcus." He looked at her, eyes serious. Number I just reminded it who it could be. Later that month, Marcus made a surprise visit to a small community college in Oakland. No press, no announcement. He simply walked into a coding workshop being led by a young professor using Lighthouse principles to teach ethical systems development. Marcus listened from the back, nodding occasionally, watching the students engage in heated, thoughtful debates about fairness, AI bias, and systemic accountability. At the end, the professor noticed him. "Mr. Williams?" she asked, stunned. The students gasped. Marcus just smiled and raised a hand. "I'm not here to talk, just observing. You're doing amazing work." One student, wide-eyed and trembling slightly, asked, "Sir, what's the biggest thing you've learned since all this began?" Marcus paused for a long moment. "That truth without humility becomes arrogance," he finally said, "and power without memory becomes cruelty." He left a small donation in the department's name and quietly exited, disappearing before the wave of cameras and media could arrive. Meanwhile, back at Technova, a new challenge was taking shape. A global government coalition had requested Marcus to serve as the lead advisor on an initiative to draft the first international digital ethics charter, something that would establish foundational rules for how AI systems could operate across borders, cultures, and economies. It would mean stepping into global politics, bureaucracy, compromise, and criticism at a scale he hadn't yet faced. The board asked him if he'd consider it. Marcus thought deeply before replying. "Yes, but only if I'm not the only voice." He insisted on forming a rotating advisory panel composed of workers from every level of the tech industry. Engineers, support staff, ethicists, activists, and even a few skeptics. He called it the human layer. Its purpose wasn't to write rules, but to ask better questions. And thus, a new chapter began. Marcus Williams, the boy once mocked in a corporate lobby, the pizza delivery kid whose algorithm had outsmarted a CEO, was now helping shape a document that could influence generations. Not by wielding power, but by sharing it. Not by crushing his enemies, but by proving that building something better was the strongest answer to being broken. As he stood before the UN Ethics Committee, prepared to deliver his opening address, Rosa texted him one line from her kitchen back home. The boy you were would be proud of the man you've become. Marcus read the message, took a deep breath, and walked toward the podium. The United Nations chamber was quieter than usual. Delegates from over 70 countries sat in attentive silence as Marcus Williams took his place at the podium. This wasn't a product launch. This wasn't a scandal expose or a redemption speech. It was something far more delicate, a collective moment when the world paused to ask not just where it was going, but whether it still knew how to steer. Marcus glanced down at the prepared speech. Then slowly he folded the paper and set it aside. I had something written, he began, but if I've learned anything, it's that words can be correct and still be wrong. So let me speak from where it matters. He paused, making eye contact with a young delegate from Kenya, an older senator from Norway, a cybersecurity advisor from South Korea. When I was 17, I delivered pizzas to this building, not literally, but symbolically. I was invisible, disposable, easy to underestimate. But being underestimated turned out to be my greatest asset, because no one sees a threat in someone they don't believe exists. That's how I learned to watch, to listen, to understand systems. A few diplomats leaned forward, curious. And here's what I saw, Marcus continued. The systems we build don't just reflect our intelligence. They reflect our fears, our prejudices, our blind spots. When we train machines to learn, we often forget that they're learning from us, and we are deeply flawed teachers. The room remained hushed, gripped by the quiet force in his voice. The digital ethics charter isn't about rules for robots. It's about reminding ourselves of what we owe each other as humans. Before we code efficiency, we must encode dignity. Before we automate decisions, we must define fairness. Before we hand over control, we must take responsibility. He looked around the room, letting each sentence land. I'm not here because I'm a genius. I'm here because I had a mother who mopped floors while teaching me to never let the world tell me my value. I'm here because a corrupt man thought I was a nobody. I'm here because someone recorded the truth when no one was watching. I'm here because I was given an opportunity by people, not just platforms. The chamber broke into applause. Marcus raised a hand gently, asking for quiet. And now I want to give that opportunity back. The human layer we've built is ready to assist every nation, every company, every school that wants to rebuild trust in technology. This isn't my project, it's yours. And if we do this right, 10 years from now, no child will grow up thinking that justice and innovation are opposites. He stepped back from the podium. The applause this time was sustained, genuine. Even the critics, the skeptics, sat a little straighter in their chairs. That night, Marcus didn't attend the gala in his honor. He returned to a quiet apartment near Harlem, one of several homes he used when he wanted solitude. Rosa called him anyway. You made the news again, she said teasingly. Did I? He asked, peeling an orange. You know you did. I saw 5 different news anchors cry. Marcus laughed. That's a new record. They spoke for a while, about his speech, about her plants, about a new intern she'd met who reminded her of him. Then she asked the question she hadn't dared ask in months. Do you ever miss being ordinary? Marcus leaned against the kitchen counter and thought for a moment. Sometime, he admitted, but being ordinary never protected us, and now I have the chance to protect others. That's my boy, she whispered. Meanwhile, in a quiet suburb outside San Diego, Richard Blackstone watched the UN broadcast on an old laptop. His face was haggard, his clothes plain. He was no longer the man who had strutted through glass towers and barked orders down gold-plated hallways. When Marcus spoke the words, "Before we automate decisions, we must define fairness," Blackstone closed the lid gently. He sat back in silence, a single tear escaping down his weathered cheek. It wasn't regret, it was recognition. He had never seen Marcus so clearly. That same week, Technova launched a new internal program called Elevate. It offered tuition, mentorship, and fast-track promotions to any employee, regardless of position, who showed innovative potential. The first graduate was a janitor named Samuel Lopez, who had redesigned the company's logistics system in his spare time. Marcus handed him the certificate personally. This time, he said, no genius will go ignored. Outside the Technova building, the city had renamed a small public square. A bronze statue stood at the center, not of Marcus, but of a woman holding a mop in one hand and a textbook in the other. The plaque read, "In honor of those who clean the future before anyone else sees it." Rosa wept when she saw it. 3 years after the day Marcus exposed Richard Blackstone and turned the tides of corporate history, the world had not just moved on, it had evolved. Technova, under Marcus's leadership, had become a symbol of ethical innovation. But Marcus never forgot that the roots of his rise were planted in silence, in injustice, and in the small acts of courage that often go unseen. On a rainy spring afternoon, Marcus returned to the apartment building where it had all begun. The paint still peeled from the outer walls. The same elevator creaked as it carried him up to the fourth floor. And Rosa's door, with its worn-out welcome mat, still stood strong like the woman who had never stopped believing in him. "Mom?" he called softly as he entered. Rosa appeared from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a towel. "I thought you'd forgotten where you came from." "Never," Marcus said, smiling. "I came to tell you something." She raised an eyebrow. "You're getting married?" He laughed. "Number not yet, but close." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out an envelope. Rosa opened it slowly. Inside was a deed. Her eyes scanned the document, then widened. "You bought the building?" "Not just this one. The whole block," Marcus said gently. "We're turning it into a community innovation hub. Free coding classes, business incubators, childcare support, housing for single parents. The kids here who deliver pizzas, who wash dishes, who dream big and get told they're too small, they're going to have a place to prove the world wrong." Rosa sat down, stunned. Her voice cracked. "You're giving them what you never had." "I'm giving them what you gave me," Marcus replied, kneeling beside her. "Belief, dignity, a fighting chance." That evening, the two of them walked the neighborhood as the sun set behind tall, red brick buildings. Some people waved. Others stared in disbelief. A few children ran up to him with phones, asking for selfies. But to Marcus, they weren't fans. They were the future. Weeks later, Marcus took the stage again, this time not at a corporate summit, but at a public school auditorium in Oakland. The event was a graduation ceremony for the first group of teens who had completed the Elevate Youth program. These were sons and daughters of janitors, delivery drivers, immigrants, and survivors. One of them had rebuilt an AI-powered translation app now used by hospitals across California. As he looked at the faces before him, Marcus felt something shift, not in the room but within himself. He realized he was no longer just a boy who had overcome. He had become a bridge between what is and what could be, between the overlooked and the undeniable. After the ceremony, a young girl approached him nervously. "Mr. Williams, my brother used to deliver pizzas like you," she said. "He didn't make it, but I think he would have believed in you." Marcus knelt down and handed her the gold medal he'd received earlier. Then he just did. Elsewhere, in a quiet town far from the tech world's spotlight, Richard Blackstone lived out his days in anonymity. No interviews, no redemption arc, just silence. The only thing that ever brought him to tears anymore was watching Marcus on TV. Not out of hatred, but out of the painful knowledge that he had tried to kill a seed that bloomed into a forest. At Technova's new headquarters, a glass wall was engraved with the words Marcus had spoken that first day as CEO. "Excellence has no color, only results." But underneath, Rosa had insisted they add another line, carved in smaller script. "And genius? Genius cleans floors, speaks softly, and wears worn-out shoes. Until it's time to lead." As the years passed, Marcus Williams became more than a CEO. He became a movement, a reminder that talent doesn't ask for permission, and justice, when patient, never misses. And once, during an interview, when asked how he would like to be remembered, Marcus smiled softly and said, "I don't care if they remember my name. I just want them to remember the lesson. Never underestimate the quiet one in the corner. That's where revolutions begin."